and where we read staying wealthy versus when we read getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. We read about Warren, Charlie, and Rick as they were friends, and then you know two of them as the scale. They all have the scale of getting wealthy, but only two has the scale of staying wealthy. So now I read about the applying the survival mindset to the real world, how it comes down to appreciating three things, and I listed it out, but I didn't go deep into how it was explained in the book, which is why I'm coming live to go into how it was explained in the book. But before that, I would like to read this. Nassim Taleb put it this way: having an edge and surviving are two different things. The first requires the second. You need to avoid ruin at all costs. Okay, if you haven't been following us and you don't know the book we're reading, this is it right here, The Psychology of Money. And if you check our previous videos, you'll see we've read quite a lot, and this is the continuation of what we are reading. Applying the survival mindset to the reward comes down to appreciating three things. One, more than I want big returns, I want to be financially unbreakable. And if I am unbreakable, I actually think I will get the biggest returns, because I'll be able to stick around long enough for compounding to work wonders. Yeah, we've read about compounding at our last reading, so you can just check it out. No one wants to hold cash during a bull market. They want to own assets that go up a lot. You look and feel conservative holding cash during a bull market, because you become acutely aware of how much return you'll be giving up by not owning the good stuff. Say cash earn 1% and we stock returns 10% a year. That's 9% gap we gnaw at you every day. But if that cash prevents you from having to sell your stocks during a bear market, the actual return you earned on that cash is not 1% a year. It could be many multiples of that, because preventing one desperate ill-timed stock sale can do more for our lifetime returns than picking dozens of big time winners. Compounding doesn't rely on any big returns. Merely good returns sustained uninterrupted for the longest period of time, especially in times of chaos and havoc, will always win. Number two, planning is important, but the most important part of every plan is to plan or the plan not going according to the plan. What's the saying? You plan, God laughs. Financial and investment planning are critical, because they let you know whether your current actions are within the realm of reasonable. But few plans of any kind survive their first encounter with the real world. If you are projecting your income, savings rights, and market returns for over the next 20 years, think about all the big stuff that has happened in the last 20 years that no one could have foreseen. September 11th, a housing boom and bust that caused nearly 10 million Americans to lose their homes. A financial crisis that caused almost 9 million to lose their jobs. A record-breaking stock market rally that ensued, and a coronavirus that shakes the world as I write this. A plan is only useful if it can survive reality. And a future filled with unknowns is everyone's reality. A good plan doesn't pretend this weren't true. It embraces it and emphasizes room for error. The more you need specific elements of a plan to be true, the more fragile your financial life becomes. If there is enough room for error in your savings rate that you can say it would be great if the market returns 8% a year over the next 30 years. But if it only does 4% a year, I'll still be okay. The more valuable your plan becomes. Many bets failed not because they were wrong, but because they were mostly right in a situation that required things to be exactly right. Room for error, often called margin for safety, is one of the most underappreciated forces in finance. It comes in many forms: a frugal budget, flexible thinking, and a loose timeline. Anything that lets you live happily with a range of outcomes. Is different from being conservative. Conservative is avoiding a certain level of risk. Margin of safety is raising the odds of success at a given level of risk by increasing your chances of survival. Its magic is that the higher your margin of safety, the smaller your edge needs to have a favorable outcome. Then number three, it says a barbed personality, optimistic about the future but paranoid about what will prevent you from getting to the future is vital. Optimism is usually defined as a belief that things will go well, but that's incomplete. Sensible optimism is a belief that the odds are in your favor, and over time, things will balance out to a good outcome, even if what happens in between is filled with misery. You can be optimistic that the long term growth trajectory is up and to the right, but equally sure that the road between now and then is filled with landmines and always will be. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The idea that something can gain over the long run while being a basket case in the short run is not intuitive, but it is how a lot of things work in life. By age 20, the average person can lose roughly half the synaptic connections they had in their brain at age 2. As inefficient and redundant neural pathways are cleared out, but the average 20-year-old is much smarter than the average 2-year-old. Distraction in the face of progress is not only possible, but an efficient way to get rid of excess. Imagine if you were a parent and could see inside your child's brain. Every morning, you notice fewer synaptic connections in your kid's head. You would panic. They would say, "This can be right. There is loss and destruction here. We need an intervention. We need to see a doctor." But you don't. What you are witnessing is the normal part of progress. Economies, markets, and careers often follow a similar path: growth amid loss. Well, should we stop there? Okay, let me just complete this. Here is how the US economy performed over the last 170 years. But do you know what happened during this period? Where do we begin? One, okay, here is it. Here is how it over the 170 years. Here is how the US economy performed. But then, do you know what happened during this period? Where do we begin? 1.3 million Americans died while fighting 9 major wars. Roughly 99.9% of all companies that were created went out of business. 4 US presidents were assassinated. 675,000 Americans died in a single year from a flu pandemic. 30 separate natural disasters killed at least 400 Americans each. 33 recessions lasted a cumulative 48 years. The number of forecasters who predicted any of those recessions round to zero. The stock market fell more than 10% from a recent high at least 102 times. Stock lost a third of their value at least 12 times. Annual inflation exceeded 7% in 20 separate years. The word economic pessimism appeared in newspaper at least 29,000 times, according to Google. Our standard of living increased 20-fold in these 170 years, but barely a day went by that lacked tangible reason for pessimism. A mindset that can be paranoid and optimistic at the same time is hard to maintain because seeing things as black or white takes less effort than accepting nuance. But you need short-term paranoia to keep you alive long enough to exploit long-term optimism. Jess Livermore figured this out the hard way. Do you remember the story of Jess Livermore? He associated good times with the end of bad times. Getting wealthy made him feel like staying wealthy was inevitable and that it was invisible. After losing nearly everything, he reflected. After losing nearly everything, he reflected, "I sometimes think that no price is too high for a speculator to pay to learn that wish will keep him from getting the swelled head. A great many smashes by brilliant men can be traced directly to the swelled head. It's an expensive disease," he said, "everywhere to everybody." Next, we'll look at another way growth in the face of adversity can be so hard to wrap your head around, which is the chapter 6, Tails, the win. You can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune. There is a quote here at the beginning of the chapter. It says, "I've been banging away at this thing for 30 years. I think the simple math is some projects works and some others don't. There is no reason to belabor either one. Just go on to the next. That's like Brad Pitt accepting a Screen Actors Guild Award. Ernst Berggruen fled Nazi Germany in 1936. He settled in America, where he studied literature at UC Berkeley. By most accounts, he did not show particular promise in his youth, but by the 1990s, Berggruen was, by any measure, one of the most successful art dealers of all time. In 2000, Berggruen sold part of his massive collection of Picassos, bricks, clays, and Matisses to the German government for more than 100 million euros. It was such a bargain that the Germans effectively considered it a donation. The private market value of the collection was well over $1 billion. That one person can collect huge quantities of masterpieces is astounding. Art is as subjective as it gets. How could anyone have foreseen early in life what were to become the most sought after works of the century? You could say skill, you could say luck. The investment firm Horizon Research has a third explanation, and it is very relevant to investors. The great investors bought vast quantities of art. The firm writes, a subset of the collections turned out to be great investments, and they were held for a sufficiently long period of time to allow the portfolio return to converge upon the return of the best elements in the portfolio. Ain't is all that happens. The great art dealers operated like index funds. They bought everything they could, and they bought it in portfolios, not individual pieces they happened to like. Then they sat and waited for a few winners to emerge. That's all that happens. Perhaps 99% of the works someone like Bergman acquired in his life turned out to be of little value, but that doesn't particularly matter if the other 1% turned out to be the work of someone like Picasso. Belgium could be wrong most of the time and still end up stupendously right. A lot of things in business and investing work this way. Long tails, the farthest end of a distribution of outcomes, have tremendous influence in finance, while a small number of events can account for the majority of outcomes. That can be hard to deal with, even if you understand the math. It is not intuitive that an investor can be wrong half that time and still make a fortune. It means we underestimate how normal it is for a lot of things to fail, which causes us to overreact when they do. So this is another story here. Steamboat Willie put Walt Disney on the map as an animator. Business success was another story. Disney's first studio went bankrupt. His films were monstrously expensive to produce and financed at outrageous things. By the midges, Disney had produced more than 400 cartoons. Most of them were short, most of them were beloved by viewers, and most of them lost a fortune. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs changed everything. The $8 million it earned in the first 6 months of 193 was an order of magnitude higher than anything the company earned previously. It transformed Disney Studios. All company debts were paid off. Key employees got retention bonuses. The company purchased a new state-of-the-art in Burbank, where it remains today. And Oscar turned Watts from famous to full-blown celebrity. By 1938, he had produced several hundred hours of films, but in business terms, the 83 minutes of Snow White were all that mattered. Anything that is huge, profitable, famous, or influential is the result of a tail event, an outlying one in thousands or millions event. And most of our attention goes to things that are huge, profitable, famous, or influential. When most of what we pay attention to is the result of a tail, it is easy to underestimate how rare and powerful they are. Some tail-driven industries are obvious. Take venture capital. If a VC makes 50 investments, they likely expect half of them to fail tend to do pretty well, and one or two to be the bonanzas that drive 100% of the fund's return. Investment firm Correlation Ventures once crunched the numbers. Out of more than 21,000 venture financing from 2004 to 2014, 65% lost money. 2.5% of investment made 10 times to 20 times. 1% made more than 20 times returns. 0.5%, about 100 companies out of 21,000, and 50 times or more. That's where the majority of the industry returns come from. This, you might think, is what makes venture capital so risky, and everyone investing in venture capital knows it is risky. Most startups fail, and the world is only kind enough to allow a few mega successes. If you want safer, predictable, and more stable returns, you invest in large public companies. Also, you might think, remember, sales drive everything. The distribution of success among large public stocks over time is not much different than it is in venture capital. Most public companies are duds. A few do well, and a handful become extraordinary winners that account for the majority of the stock market returns. JP Morgan, as JP Morgan Asset Management once published the distribution of returns for the Russell 3000 index, a big, broad collection of public companies since 1980. 40% of all Russell 3000 stock companies lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered over this period. Effectively, all of the index overall returns came from of 7% of companies that outperformed by at least two standard deviations. That's the kind of thing you'd expect from venture capital, but it is what happened inside a boring, diversified index. This dumping of most public companies spares no industry. More than half of all public technology and telecom companies lose more of their value and never recover. Even among public utilities, the failure rate is more than 1 in percentage. Then there is a diagram of the percentage of companies experiencing catastrophic loss from 1980 to 2014. There's technology, telecom, energy, consumer discretionary, healthcare, industrials, materials, consumer staples, financials, and utilities. Well, moving on, reading on. The interesting thing here is that you have to have achieved a certain level of success to become a public company and a member of the Russell 3000. Sorry about that. They are established corporations, not fly-by-night startups. Even still, most have lifespans measured in years, not generations. Take an example, one of these companies, Carolco, a former member of the Russell 3000 index. It produced some of the biggest films of the 1980s and 1990s, including the first three Rambo films, Terminator 2, Basic Instinct, and Total Recall. I think I watched Terminator. Carolco went public in 1987. It was a huge success, churning out hit after hit. It did have $1 billion in revenue in 1991, commanding a market cap of $400 million, big money back then, especially for a film studio. And then it failed. The blockbuster stopped, a few big budget projects flopped, and by the mid 1990s, Karoko was history. Probably why I've never heard of them. It went bankrupt in 1996. Okay, stock goes to zero. Have a nice day. Wow. A catastrophic loss, and one that 4 in 10 public companies experience over time. Haroko's story is not worth telling because it is unique, but because it is common. Here is the most important part of the story. The Russell 3000 has increased more than 73-fold since 1980. That is a spectacular return. That is success. 40% of the companies in the index were effectively failures. But the 7% of components that performed extremely well were more than enough to offset the dot. Just like Ains, Belgian, but with Microsoft and Walmart instead of Picasso and Matisse. But only do a few companies account for most of the market's return, but within these companies are even more tail events. In 2018, Amazon drove 6% of the S&P 500 return, and Amazon's growth is almost entirely due to Prime and Amazon Web Services, which itself are tail events in a company that has experimented with hundreds of products from the Fire Phone to travel agencies. Apple was responsible for almost 7% of the index returns in 2018, and it is driven overwhelmingly by the iPhone, which in the world of tech products is as staley as tails gets. And who is working at these companies? Google's annual acceptance rate is 0.2%, Facebook is 0.1%, Apple's is about 2%. So the people working on these tail projects that drive tail returns have tail careers. The idea that a few accounts for most results is not just true for companies in your investment portfolio. It's also an important part of your own behavior as an investor. Napoleon's definition of a military genius was the man who can do the average thing when all those around him are going crazy. It's the same in investing. Most financial advice is about today. What should you do right now? And what stocks looks like good buys today. But most of the time, today is not that important. Wow. Over the course of your lifetime, as an investor, these decisions that you make today or tomorrow or next week will not matter nearly as much as what you do during the small number of days, likely 1% of the time or less when everyone else around you is going crazy. Consider what would happen if you saved $1 every month from 1900 to 2019. You could invest that $1 into the US stock market every month, rain or shine. It doesn't matter if economists are screaming about a looming recession or new bear market. You just keep investing. Let's call an investor who does this, Sue. But maybe investing during a recession is too scary. So perhaps you invest your $1 in the stock market when the economy is not in a recession. Sell everything when it is in recession and save your monthly dollar in cash. And invest everything back into the stock market when the recession ends. We'll call this investor gym. Or perhaps it takes a few months for a recession to scare you out, and then it takes a while to regain confidence before you get back in the market. You invest $1 in stock when there is no recession, sell 6 months after a recession begins, and invest back in 6 months after a recession ends. We'll call you Tom. Okay? How much money would these three investors end up with over time? So ends up with $435 and $551. Jim has $257, $386. Tom Sue wins by a mile. There were 1,428 months between 1900 and 2019. Just over 300 of them were during a recession. So by keeping our cool, during just the 22% of the time the economy was in or near a recession, Sue ends up with almost three-quarters more money than Jim or Tom. To give a more recent example, how you behaved as an investor during a few months in the late 2008 and early 2009 will likely have more impact on your lifetime returns than everything you did from 2000 to 2008. There is the old pilot quip that their jobs are hours and hours of freedom, hours and hours of boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. It's the same in investing. Your success as an investor will be determined by how you respond to punctuated moments of terror, not the years spent on cruise control. A good definition of an investing genius is the man or woman who can do the average thing when all those around them are going crazy. Sales drive everything, remember. So moving on, reading on. This is another story, I think. When you accept that sales drive everything in business, okay, this is not a story. When you accept that sales drive everything in business, investing and finance, you realize that it is normal for lots of things to go wrong, break, fail, and fall. If you are a good stock picker, you will be right maybe half the time. If you are a good business leader, maybe half of your products and strategy ideas will work. If you are a good investor, most years will be just okay, and plenty will be bad. If you are a good worker, you will find the right company in the right field after several attempts and trials. And that's if you are good. Peter Lynch is one of the best investors of our time. If you are terrific in this business, you are right 6 times out of 10, he said. There are fields where you must be perfect every time. Flying a plane, for example. Then there are fields where you want to be at least pretty good nearly all the time. A restaurant chef, let's say. Investing, business, and finance are just not like these fields. Something I've learned from both investors and entrepreneurs is that no one makes good decisions all the time. The most impressive people are packed full of horrendous ideas that are often acted upon. Take Amazon. It's not intuitive to think a failed product launch at a major company would be normal and fine. Intuitively, you'd think the CEO should apologize to shareholders, but CEO Jeff Bezos said shortly after the disastrous launch of the company's Fire phone, if you think that's a big failure, we are working on much bigger failures right now. Wow. We are working on much bigger failures right now. I am not kidding. Some of them are going to make the Fire phone look like a tiny little blip. It's okay for Amazon to lose a lot of money on the Fire phone because it will be offset by something like Amazon Web Services that earn tens of billions of dollars. Toes to the rescue. Netflix CEO Reed Hastings once announced his company was canceling several big budget productions. He responded, "Our hit ratio is way too high right now. I'm always pushing the content team. We have to take more risks. You have to try more crazy things because we should have a higher cancel rate overall." These are not deletions or failures of responsibility. They are a smart acknowledgement of how sales drive success. For every Amazon Prime or Orange is the new black, with certainty that you have some doubts. Part of why this isn't intuitive is because in most fields, we only see the finished product, not the losses incurred that led to the tail success product. Part of why this isn't intuitive is because in most fields, okay, we only see the finished product, sorry. The Chris Rock I see on TV is hilarious, flawless. The Chris Rock that performs in dozens of small clubs each year is just okay. That is by design. No comedic genius is smart enough to preemptively know that jokes will land well. Every big comedian tests their material in small clubs before using it in big venues. Rock was once asked if he missed small clubs. He responded, "When I start a tour, it's not like I start out in arenas. Before this last tour, I performed in this place in New Brunswick called the Stress Factory. I did about 40 or 50 shows getting ready for the tour." Wow. One newspaper profiled these small club sessions. It described Rock thumbing through pages of notes and fumbling with material. "I am going to have to cut some of these jokes," it says, mixed skit. The good jokes I see on Netflix are the tale that stuck out of a universe of hundreds of attempts. A similar thing happens in investing. It's easy to find Warren Buffett's net worth, or his average annual returns, or even his best, most notable investments. They are right there in the open, and they are what people talk about. It's much harder to piece together every investment he has made over his career. No one talks about the dirt pigs, the ugly businesses, the poor acquisition part of Buffett's story. They are the other side of the tail-driven returns. At the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting in 2013, Warren Buffett said he has owned 400 to 500 stocks during his life and made most of his money on 10 of them. Wow. Charlie Munger followed up. If you remove just a few of Berkshire's top investments, its long-term track record is pretty average. When we pay special attention to a role model success, we overlook that their gains came from a small percent of their actions. That makes our own failures, losses, and setbacks feel like we are doing something wrong. But it's possible we are wrong, or just sort of right, just as often as the masters. They may have been more right than they were right when they were right, but they could have been wrong just as often as you. It's not whether you are right or wrong that is important, George Soros once said, but how much money you make when you are right and how much money you lose when you are wrong. You can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune. There are 100 billion planets in our galaxy and only one, as far as we know, with intelligent life. Can you guess which it is? Which is it? Earth. The fact that you are reading this book is the result of the longest tale you can imagine. That's something to be happy about. Next, let's look at how money can make you even happier. Chapter 7, Freedom. Controlling your time is the highest dividend money pays. The highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. People want to become wealthier to make them happier. Happiness is a complicated subject because everyone's happiness is different. But if there is a common denominator in success, a universal full of joy, it's that people want to control their lives. The ability to do what you want, when you want, with who you want, for as long as you want is priceless. It is the highest dividend money pays. There's a story right here. Now reading on. Angus Campbell was a psychologist at the University of Michigan. Born in 1910, his research took place during an age when psychology was overwhelmingly focused on disorders that brought people down. Things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. I don't know what that is. This is my first time coming across this word. Okay, so Campbell wanted to know what made people happy. His 1981 books, The Sense of Well-Being in America, starts by pointing out that people are generally happier than many psychologists assumed. But some were clearly doing better than others, and you couldn't necessarily group them by income or geography or education because so many in each of these categories end up chronically unhappy. The most powerful common denominator of happiness was simple. Campbell summed it up. Having a strong sense of controlling one's life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any of the objective conditions of life we have considered. More than your salary, more than the size of your house, more than the prestige of your job, control over doing what you want, when you want to, with the people you want to, is the broadest lifestyle variable that makes people happy. Money's greatest intrinsic value, and this can be overstated, is in its ability to give you control over your time, to obtain bit by bit a level of independence and autonomy that comes from unspent assets that gives you greater control over what you can do and when you can do it. A small amount of wealth means ability to take a few days off, get late, work when you are sick without breaking the bank. Gaining that ability is huge, even if you don't have it. Gaining that ability is huge if you don't have it. A bit more means waiting for a good job to come around after you get laid off, rather than having to take the first one you find. That can be life-changing. 6 months emergency expenses means not being terrified of your boss because you know you won't be around if you have to take some time off to find a new job. More still means the ability to take a job with lower pay but flexible hours, maybe one with a shorter commute, or being able to deal with a medical emergency without the added burden of worrying about how you will pay for it. Then there is retiring when you want to instead of when you need to. Using your money to buy time and options as a lifestyle benefit few luxury goods can compete with. Throughout college, I wanted to be an investment banker. There was only one reason why: they made a lot of money. That was the only drive. And one was 1% positive would make me happier. Once I got it, I scored a summer internship at an investment bank in Los Angeles in my junior year and thought I won the career lottery. This is all I ever wanted. On my first day, I realized why investment bankers make a lot of money. They work longer and more controlled hours than I knew humans could handle. Actually, most can't handle it. Going home before midnight was considered a luxury, and there was a saying in the office: if you don't come to work on Saturday, don't bother coming back on Sunday. The job was intellectually stimulating, paid well, and made me feel important. But every waking second of my time became a slave to my boss' demand, which was enough to turn it into one of the most miserable experiences of my life. It was a 4 month internship. I lasted a month. The hardest thing about this was that I loved the work and I wanted to work hard, but doing something you love on a schedule you can control can feel the same as doing something you hate. There is a name for this feeling. Psychology calls it reactance. Jonah Berger, a marketing professor in the University of Pennsylvania, summed it up well. People like to feel they are in control, in the driver's seat. When we try to get them to do something, they feel disempowered. Rather than feeling like they made the choice, they feel like we made it for them. So they say no or do something else, even when they might have originally been happy to go along. When you accept how true that statement is, you realize that aligning money towards a life that lets you do what you want, when you want, with who you want, where you want, for as long as you want, has incredible return. Derek Sivin, a successful entrepreneur, once wrote about a friend who asked him to tell the story about how he got rich. I had a day in Midtown Manhattan, paying Salk per year, about minimum wage. I never ate out and never took a taxi. My cost of living was about $100,000 per month, and I was earning 108,000 dollars per month. I did this for 2 years and saved up $12,000. I was 22 years old. Once I had $12,000, I could quit my job and become a full-time musician. I knew I could get a few gigs per month to pay my cost of living. So I was free. I quit my job a month later and never had a job again. When I finished telling my friend this story, he asked for more. I said no, that was it. He said no, what about when you sold your company? I said no, that didn't make any difference in my life. That was just more money in the bank. The difference happened when I was 22. I want to take it again. I did this for 2 years and saved up $12,000. I was 22 years old. Once I had $12,000, I could quit my job and become a full-time musician. I knew I could get a few gigs per month to pay my cost of living, so I was free. I quit my job a month later and never had a job again. Wow. Moving on to another story. The United States is the richest nation in the history of the world, but there is little evidence that its citizens are, on average, happier today than they were in 19505, when wealth and income were much lower, even at the median level and adjusted for inflation. A 2019 Gallup poll of 150,000 people in 140 countries found out that about 45% of Americans said they felt a lot of worry the previous day. The global average was 39%. 55% of Americans said they felt a lot of stress the previous day. For the rest of the world, 35% said the same for the rest of the world. I think there was a mistake here. Part of what has happened here is that we've used our greater wealth to buy bigger and better stuff, but we've simultaneously given up more control over our time. At best, those things cancel each other out. Median family income adjusted for inflation was 29,000 in 1955. In 2019, it was just over 162,000. We've used that wealth to live a life hardly conceivable to the 1950s Americans, even for a median family. The median American home increased from 983 square feet in 1950 to 2,436 square feet in 2018. The average new American home now has more bedrooms than occupants. Our cars are faster and more efficient. Our TV are cheaper and sharper. What has happened to our time, on the other hand, barely looks like progress. And a lot of reason had to do with the kind of job most of us have now. John D. Rockefeller was one of the most successful businessmen of all time. He was also a recluse, spending most of his time by himself. He rarely spoke, deliberately making himself inaccessible and staying quiet when you caught his attention. A refinery worker who occasionally had Rockefeller's ear once remarked, he lets everybody else talk while he sits back and say nothing. When asked about the silence during meetings, Rockefeller often recited a poem. A wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he had. Why aren't we all like that wise old bird? Rockefeller was a strange guy, but he figured out something that now applies to tens of millions of workers. Rockefeller's job wasn't to drill wells, load trains, or move barrels. It was to think and make good decisions. Rockefeller's product, his deliverable, wasn't what he did with his hands or even his words. It was what he figured out inside his head. So that's where he spends most of his time and energy. Despite sitting quietly most of the day in what might have looked like free time or leisure hours to most people, he was constantly working in his mind, thinking problems through. This was unique in his day. Almost all jobs during Rockefeller's time required doing things with your hand. In 1870, 46% of jobs were in agriculture and 35% were in craft or manufacturing, according to economist Robert Gordon. Few professions relied on a worker's brain. You didn't think, you labored without interruptions, and your work was visible and tangible. Today, that is flipped. 38% of jobs are now designated as managers, officials, and professionals. These are decision-making jobs. Another 41% are service jobs that often rely on your thoughts as much as your actions. More of us have jobs that look close to Rockefeller than a typical 1950s manufacturing worker, which means our days don't end when we clock out and leave the factory. We are constantly working in our heads, which means it feels like work never ends. If your job is to build cars, there is little you can do when you're not on the assembly line. You detach from work and leave your tools in the factory. But if your job is to create a marketing campaign, a thought-based and decision job, your tool is your head, which never leaves you. You might be thinking about your project during your commute, as you are making dinner, about why you put your kids to sleep, and when you wake up stressed at 3 in the morning. You might be on clock for fewer hours than you would in 1950, but it feels like you are working 24/7. Derek Thompson of The Atlantic once described it like this: if the operating equipment of the 21st century is a portable device, this means the modern factory is not a place at all. It is the day itself. The computer age has liberated the tools of productivity from the office. Most knowledge workers whose laptops and smartphones are portable all-purpose media making machines can theoretically be as productive at 2 p.m. in the main office as at 2 a.m. in Tokyo. We work or at midnight on a couch. Compared to generations prior, control over your time has diminished. And since controlling your time is such a key to happiness, is such a key happiness influencer, we shouldn't be surprised that people don't feel much happier, even though we are on average richer than ever. What do we do about that? It's not an easy problem to solve because everyone is different. The first step to is merely acknowledging what does and does not make almost everyone happy. In his book 30 Lessons for Living, gerontologist Carl Pileman interviewed 1,000 elderly Americans looking for the most important lessons they learned from decades of life experience. He wrote, not one, not a single person out of 1,000 said that to be happy, you should try to work as hard as you can to make money to buy the things you want. Not one, not a single person said it is important to be at least as wealthy as the people around you. And if you have more than they do, it's real success. Not one, not a single person said you should choose your work based on your desired future earning power. What they did value were things like quality friendships, being part of something bigger than themselves, and spending quality unstructured time with their children. Your kids don't want your money or what your money buys anywhere as much as they want you. Specifically, they want you to be with them. Pilema writes, take it from those who have lived through everything. Controlling your time is the highest dividend money pays. Now, a short chapter on one of the lowest dividend money pays. That's chapter 8, Man in the Car Paradox. No one is impressed with your possessions as much as you are. And that's we'll be reading that at our next video. Okay, it's a short paragraph. Let's just get on with it. The best part of being a valet is getting to drive some of the coolest car to ever touch pavements. Guests came in driving Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls Royce, the whole aristocratic fleet. It was my dream to have one of these cars of my own because I thought they sent such a strong signal to others that you made it. You are smart, you are rich, you have taste, you are important. Look at me. The irony is that I rarely, if ever, looked at them, the drivers. When you see someone driving a nice car, you rarely think, wow, the guy driving that car is cool. Instead, you think, wow, if I had that car, people would think I am cool. Subconscious or not, this is how people think. There is a paradox here. People tend to want words to signal to others that they should be liked and admired. But in reality, those others them, often bypass admiring you, not because they don't think wealth is admirable, but because they use your wealth as a benchmark for their own desire to be liked and admired. The letter I wrote after my son was born was, you might think you want an expensive car, a fancy watch, a huge house, but I'm telling you, you don't. What you want is respect and admiration from other people. And you think having expensive stuff will bring it. It almost never does, especially from the people you want to respect and admire you. I learned that as a valet when I began thinking about all the people driving up to the hotel in their Ferraris, watching me gawk. People must gawk everywhere they went, and I'm sure they loved it. I'm sure they felt admired, but they didn't know I did not care about them or even notice them. They didn't know I was only gawking at the car and imagining myself in the driver's seat. Did they buy a Ferrari thinking it would bring them admiration without realizing that I, and likely most others who are impressed with the car, didn't actually give them, the driver, a moment's thought? Does this same idea apply to those living in big homes? Almost certainly. Jewelry and clothes? Yep. My point here is not to abandon the pursuit of wealth or even fancy cars. I like both. It's a subtle recognition that people generally aspire to be respected and admired by others. And using money to buy fancy things may bring less of it than you imagine. If respect and admiration are your goal, be careful how you seek it. Humility, kindness, and empathy will bring you more respect than horsepower ever will. We are not done talking about Ferraris. Another story about the paradox of fast cars is in the next chapter. which is chapter 9. Weight is what you don't see. Spending money to show people how much money you have is the fastest way to have less money. Okay, so we'll read that at our next reading. So someone joined and someone left. So I, this will be recorded, so you can just go over it. And thanks for reading. If you read to this level, to this stage, thanks for reading with me. See you at our next reading. Bye.